Greetings, salutations. My name's Joel Duff. Welcome back to the channel. We're in the middle of a series called the Dead Sea Chronicles, and we're up to part 9. Yeah, we're going back down below sea level. We're going back beyond, I believe, 6,000 years. We're going to look at the archaeology of the Jordan Valley in this particular episode. As we continue our journey through what has been a sort of a romp through the geological wonders of the Dead Sea region, we've been finding ourselves faced with many questions. Implications about Earth's history, the age of the Earth, and of course, we're seeing how that interfaces with scriptures and scriptural interpretation. Now, in previous chapters, we've explored the formation of the Dead Sea, an ancient Lake Lasan, the seismic history recorded in the sediments that are below the Dead Sea. And now we're ready to turn our attention to the archaeological evidence of human habitation in the Jordan Valley. This evidence doesn't just present a challenge to our young Earth creationist friends, those who believe that the world is less than 6,000 years old. All right? It's not just a challenge to their interpretation of Earth's history. I think the observations, the evidence that I'm going to present today are things that all Christians have to grapple with at some point. They have to grapple with the evidence of the age of human habitation in this particular region. So we've been exploring the geological evidence, the geological history of the Dead Sea Basin, the Jordan Valley. And I've been doing this as a Christian, all right? Somebody who takes both faith and science seriously. I'm a PhD scientist. And overall, I'm pretty comfortable with how I find the interface of that science and faith. And I'll be talking a lot more about my specific interpretations of scripture and how that jives with the geological evidence that I've presented in the series in the last part, which is part 12. But as I approach this particular topic, right, the chronology of humans in history, I approach it with a mix of, I'll say, fascination, but also a little bit of trepidation. I'm aware that discussions of the age of the earth and our place in it in particular, those questions can be divisive, especially in, I'll say, the North American evangelical church, which broadly represents who I am and therefore is my main point of concern for those of you maybe coming from outside of that particular tradition and watching this particular series. Often this question of the age of the earth really pits one brother against another in the church. But there's nothing that gets people wrangled more, I'd say, in the church than starting to talk about our own origins and our own history in the age of people, all right? The age of humanity. So like I said, with a little bit of trepidation, I'm taking this particular topic on now, but I feel like I have to address this, all right? We've talked all about geology, the geological evidence for the ancient, derivation, the ancient origins of these geological features. But now we have another obvious feature in the Dead Sea Valley, and that is signs of human habitation. And we got to wonder, how old are those? Where did those fit in that particular chronology? And I believe, as a follower of Christ myself, we're all called to pursue truth wherever that's going to lead us. And I think we have to trust that all truth is God's truth, properly interpreted. So it's in that spirit that I invite you to join me in examining the evidence with, I'd say, open minds and humble hearts as we proceed. In this part, we're going to focus on the archaeological remains in ancient cities in the Jordan Valley and how their history aligns, or I'm going to say doesn't align, or we're going to find doesn't align with the young Earth creationist timeline. This timeline typically suggests that the Jordan Valley must have originated no more than 4,350 years ago. That was the end of the flood of Noah's day. And then by about 4,100 years ago, probably looked much as it does today and hasn't really changed a whole lot since, other than the Dead Sea has fallen more and more and more, especially in the last 100 years. Go back to episode 2 for that. So this leads young Earth creationists in their particular chronology of world history. This leads them with only a 250-year window for all the geological and archaeological evidence we've encountered so far in our series, parts 1 through 8. All right. They have to squeeze all that information and somehow interpret all of that data, all those observations, all those what I'll call the facts, all right, that I presented. They have to interpret those within a 250-year time frame. As we'll see, this compressed timeline creates significant challenges. In other words, the data I'm going to present now, in addition to that, presents even additional challenge to that geological evidence. Because I'm confronted in this particular episode with a wealth of evidence that's right from the ground, in most cases, right on the surface of the ground, right? With human artifacts right beneath our feet. Now, before we proceed with the archaeology, we do have to back up and do a very brief review of some of the geological context of the Jordan Valley for those of you who weren't paying attention to the previous 8 episodes, or more likely haven't watched the previous episodes or didn't even know about them. As we've seen in previous parts of this series, the Jordan Valley isn't just merely a depression in the Earth's surface. It's a really dynamic landscape shaped by powerful forces over immense periods of time. And if you remember, the heart of the valley's formation is the Dead Sea transform fault system. That's a major tectonic boundary where the Arabian plate and the African plate are sliding past each other. And really, you can see it on this graphic. I've turned, the Levant region on its side here just to fit on this slide better. And so here you have the Dead Sea Valley, or the Jordan Valley. And here's the Dead Sea itself. And this gives you a feeling like, there's a lot of depth to this, right? It's well below sea level, most of this valley, with these mountains or the plateau that's surrounding it. And this is the result of 2 plates that are sliding past each other, but also as they're sliding past each other, they're getting torqued slightly and pulling apart. And that pulling apart allows the land between that region to fall down farther into the crust of the earth, resulting in a valley that's below sea level. I've used this graphic and similar ones multiple times, kind of a cross-section showing that you have these older rocks, right, that have fallen far down into this basin. So these rocks were originally all up here. They've fallen down in there, and then the basin has filled with sediments. And of course, we've spent a lot of time talking about the salt that's in these and the various sediments and the evidence of earthquake seismites that are in the sediment column and so forth. All right, we're going to be talking more about that salt in the next episode coming up. None of the steps that we talked about in terms of the geological evolution of the current topology of the Levant region are rapid events. Rather, all of them seem to occur over extensive periods of time. The shaping of the Jordan Valley simply can't be confined to a 250-year time frame between Noah's flood and the earliest written accounts of this region as proposed by young Earth creationism. Instead, the evidence points to a landscape molded at least over hundreds of thousands of years. It's a testament, really, to Earth's dynamic nature. If we find evidence, then, of cities, hunting implements, hearths for cooking, or other artifacts, or other evidence of human invention lying right there on the surface of the landscape of the Dead Sea Basin, basic geological principles tell us that these artifacts must have been left here at these locations following the development of the landscape itself. So therefore, constricting the timeline even further for all the thousands of feet of sediments that lie below the Dead Sea Valley. We got to turn our attention to the remarkable human history preserved in the Jordan Valley. This region contains some of the world's oldest continuously inhabited cities, many of which lie well below sea level. Their very existence and the layers, the many, many layers of human occupation they contain present a really formidable challenge to the young Earth timeline. So here's where I'm going to say that I'm not going to do a detailed overview of every single one of these different sites. And this is but a small sample of the overall archaeological digs and locations in the Jordan Valley. What I'm going to do is I'm just really going to talk in detail about one particular site. And this is sort of a summary of other things that I can make some general points about. But on my blog post that's associated with this particular video that I'll link below this video, I have many more details and descriptions of all these different locations in addition to all the references to those. So for this particular episode, again, I'm just going to hit the broad highlights. I've kind of just summarized some material, but if you want to find all the details, I have much more for those of you who are curious. Starting out, and the one we'll spend some time on, is Jericho, right? 10,000 BCE, that's before the Common Era. That would be before 2,000 years ago, so 12,000 years till present. And many people know Jericho as being the oldest, or said to be the oldest continuously inhabited city. We'll talk about the walls of Jericho falling and that particular date and so forth when we look at some more details. But the really crucial thing that I want to point out to you is that this city is minus 875 feet. So that's 875 feet below sea level. Now remember, the Dead Sea is around 1,400 feet below sea level. All right, so Jericho's a little ways up the side of the valley right now. Then you have Ein Gedi, 3500 BC, so that'd be 5500 years before the common, before now. And so I'm going to point out that these are obviously dates that young Earth creationists can't accept, because they're saying that the oldest civilization possible, all right, in the Jordan Valley would be 4,500 years. But that would assume that a civilization was established immediately after the flood ended. But looking back at the last 8 episodes, you also have to explain where all the sediments in the valley came from. And all of these, and I'm just going to give away all the big points here right away. All of these settlements are found essentially on the surface. All right. Maybe under a little bit of debris. All right. But not underneath lake deposits. Right, they're not eroding out of some ancient lake deposit as if they were deposited long ago and they're now being exposed. No, these are things that are on the surface, and they might be very, very old, but they haven't been covered over. And so we have to deal with the 15,000 feet of sediment that's below them. All of that has to have been deposited before you can actually build a city on that site. And what's even more important is all that material has to be kind of consolidated below you before it's solid enough that you're going to want to stay there and be there, right? Trees have to grow there, and so all that stuff takes time. So really, young Earth creationists can't really say that any of these places are 4,500 years old. They're going to have to say there's something less than that. And again, I'm not going to go over every one of these, but you can see some pretty old dates: 23,000 BCE, 12,000 BCE, 7,200 BCE, 7,250 BCE. Right? All these different locations are suggestive of, or at least the modern dating methods, which I'll talk about what some of those methods are in a moment, point to there being habitations, humans living in settlements, all right, of various sizes, anywhere from 20,000 years ago till present. And then over here in the elevation, you have 875. Oh, what's great about Ein Gedi for our particular series, and the points that I've been making in this series, is it's 1,329 feet below sea level. Well, sea level's Dead Sea is only 1,400 and something, feet below sea level today. So it's only sitting up about 100 feet above the current Dead Sea. And there isn't evidence that Ein Gedi, right, has been covered with water, right? There aren't flood deposits, there aren't lake deposits, right, on top of the ancient remains. So that suggests that it's never been covered by a lake. So if it's 3,300 years old, 3,500 BCE, or 5,500 years old, or in the young Earth creationist timeline, at least 4,000 years old, right? A settlement that would have been there when Abraham and Lot looked down into the valley as recorded in Genesis, and they saw that it was a good place to live, right? There's oases and there's trees and there's the ability to have agriculture in different places because of the freshwater springs that exist. Ein Gedi would have been one of those particular locations. But it's 1,329 feet below sea level, so that restricts when all the sediments that are part of that they're sitting on, because Ein Gedi is sitting on top of thousands and thousands of feet of sediments and a lot of precipitates, which are things like salts, all right, in layers, like that is in my background right here, and that I showed you just a few moments ago, right? This is the kind of stuff that's below that city. This is the kind of stuff that's below that particular settlement. And so one has to ask, when was this laid down in order for that settlement to be built upon it? That's the really serious challenge that I'm presenting to young Earth creationists in this particular series. All right, so there's other places, all right? And I'm afraid of saying some of the names because I'm going to probably butcher them, but Qumran is very famous for the site where the Dead Sea Scrolls are. And it's also very far down into the Dead Sea Valley at 1,292 feet below sea level. And we also have several other settlements that are over 1,200 feet, nearly 1,300 feet below sea level as well. And then a variety of others that are not quite as deep. All right, but nonetheless, many, many settlements, and this is just a snapshot of some of the most famous ones that are well below sea level. And none of these that I know of have any lake deposits that are found on the the remains. Right, the remains are exposed. It looks like they have, the city was abandoned in several different cases, and it's just been eroding, right, not being deposited upon. Okay, so what I want to do is I just want to look at one place. We don't need to, go over every single one of these. That kind of they're all telling the same message about the history of the Dead Sea Basin. So we'll just look at one, which is the most famous one. And then if you want to learn more about the others, I have those in my blog post. So here we have a paper about Jericho, or its archaeological name, Tel Es Sultan. All right, this is archaeoseismic evidence of two Neolithic earthquakes, one at 7,500 and one at 6,000 BC. That would be 9,500 years ago and 8,000 years ago. All right, at ancient Jericho. In the journal Seismological Research Letters from 2012. So the thing about Jericho and the remains at Jericho is that there's one central area that's been built upon many, 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 many times. Right? There's been successive settlements there. Some of them have been destroyed by earthquakes. Some have been invaded, all right, destroyed by invasion. Think of Joshua's army coming to Jericho, making the walls fall down, right? And then other times it may have just been abandoned, like say during really difficult environmental conditions. All right. Nonetheless, what you have is you have destruction or at least decay of the settlement. And then you have taking some of that material and building up new walls and building up new material on top of it. And then that gets destroyed and there's a pile of rubble, and then you build on top of that. So it's successive settlements, one after another. So archaeologists, of course, are digging down through that, and it's kind of like a sediment profile. It's kind of like looking at the Dead Sea sediments, right? The ones on the top represent the most recent deposition. And as you move down, you're looking at older and older and older layers. Same thing happens at some of these settlements that have been resettled or rebuilt over and over and over again. And so one of the things that can cause, this settlement to be destroyed and have to be rebuilt would obviously be earthquakes. There's been some very significant earthquakes along the Dead Sea Fault. After all, it's a fault, right? And you have not only the sliding past of two different continental plates, but you also have this pulling apart and the falling of material in between. And that pulling apart, and especially the falling, can create very significant lurches in this particular area. So here we have a table, periods with earthquake-induced damaging as inferred from archaeological data. Looking at sections in this series of different settlements over time, looking at destruction periods, and then dating the materials in the archaeological site, you get an idea of like, okay, it was destroyed here, it was destroyed here, it was destroyed at this time, it was destroyed at this time, and so forth. And then from the way that it's been destroyed, some of those can be inferred to have been from earthquakes. And amazingly, you can take some of that earthquake data and you can compare that to the earthquake data in the sediment profile underneath the Dead Sea and correlate the two. But you see these ages here, right? You got 10,500 BC, 3,400 BC, all the way up to 2,100 BC. And then there's more recent destructions, including the 1400 BC one, which may be related to the event recorded in scriptures in the book of Joshua. So many different destructions, many of which are thought to have been caused by earthquakes. So I want to show you where Jericho is. So here we have the Jordan River. The Dead Sea is just south of here, right? This is spilling into the Dead Sea, not far down from here. And then Jericho is smack dab right up against basically the side of the valley. All right, so you have the valley, which is full of sediments, and that's what this bluish material is, right? Pleistocene to Holocene deposits. Those are the deposits I showed you that filled up the Dead Sea Valley. The Pliocene is mostly that salt, that very thick salt layer at the bottom, which is when it was some kind of a lagoon, which was fed by the Mediterranean Sea, and water evaporated, leaving lots of salt. Then on top of that, there's lake sediments from a variety of fairly deep lakes that were much higher stands in this particular area. And eventually those lakes are shriveling up and you have Lake Lasan. And most of the sediment here that Jericho is sitting on is Lake Lasan sediments, except that Jericho is right at the edge of the mountains that come up. And those are older rocks, right? That's original material from the original continent before it split. And as it split, you have the original rock that's eroding and then materials being deposited in the valley. And so some of Jericho is built on some remnants of that Cretaceous rock, which is much older, harder material. But the idea is that this is down in the valley quite deep. So as this relates to the challenge of the age of the earth and the challenge to sort of, I will say, biblical chronology, where does Jericho fit in? And how is this evidence that Jericho has been around a long time and has been destroyed many, many, many times? So I'll go back to something we covered a couple episodes ago, and that is Steve Austin. Steve Austin is a young earth creationist geologist. He has a legitimate PhD in geology. In fact, remember we said his PhD is in sedimentology. And so who better to have actually studied the Dead Sea sediments, really the only young earth creationist that I know of that has studied any aspect of the Dead Sea sediments. And he wrote this really fantastic paper, Greatest Earthquakes of the Bible. He tries to trace all the major earthquakes that are recorded in scriptures over time. Many secular scientists have done so as well. And I made the point that he agrees, all right, this is a point of agreement between secular geologists studying the earthquake history in the Dead Sea sediments and Steve Austin, a young earth creationist. And the reason they agree is because they're both looking at the top 20 feet or so of the sediment column. This sediment column, by the way, is very close to Ein Gedi, but also quite close to Jericho. And at that particular location, he finds all these different seismites. So what each one of these little dark markers represents are disturbances in the sediment layers. And what caused those disturbances? Well, pretty much everybody agrees, including this young earth creationist, that disturbance is the result of an earthquake. An earthquake that when the bottom of the lake was right here and there was just water above it, the top layers of sediments, when the earth shook, they got mixed, right? Because they were loose, right? And as a result, they mixed. Whereas the sediments below, which have been consolidated and were stiff, right, and starting to lithify, right, they just moved with the earthquake. And as a result, the layers in this section all were preserved, but these layers were all mixed up. And so that's called a seismite, right? Evidence of it's like a footprint of an earthquake in the sediments. And so every one of these little dark bars represents an earthquake. And what he did was he traced one really significant earthquake, not recorded in the Bible, in this case, 31 BC, but is recorded in many other records in this region. And then there's the 33 AD, or approximately 33 AD earthquake, which is recorded in scriptures. And so by anchoring this sediment profile right here, and then finding that there's a 1033 AD, which is recorded in other historical annals, and that marks there. And then there's other earthquakes more recently, right? So all these earthquakes everyone's pretty confident, like, yes, that makes sense. These are recording those earthquakes. And so as we go down that sediment profile, we get down to, we got 31 BC, and then there's 750 BC, which is, that is the earthquake that's recorded in the book of Amos, right, in scriptures. And that would be around 750 BC. And so he says, like, well, now if you look all the way down here at 2050, right, these two sites are likely the remains of Sodom and Gomorrah. A thick disturbed zone within the Dead Sea sediment core assignable to Sodom and Gomorrah event occurs at the depth of about 18.5 feet. That's right here. So at 18.5 feet, he's saying, hey, look, there's Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, Sodom and Gomorrah is like 4,000 years ago. Now, what I didn't mention when we were talking about this last time was, what about this one at 1400 BC? That one at 1400 BC would be the earthquake or potential earthquake recorded in scriptures that coincides with the event of the walls of Jericho falling, all right, in the book of Joshua. Right. And Steve Austin does, I think, makes a short note about that in one of his other writings that he talks about this, not in this particular paper. Right? So in a nutshell, what you're seeing here is in this top 20 feet, you have a representation of the last 4,000 years of history. Steve Austin saying, yes, this is 4,000 years of history, and it confirms the earthquakes recorded in scriptures. Great. We have nice confirmation of physical evidence of things that are mentioned in the recordings of scriptures. One little problem. All right, if this is 1400 BC and that's Joshua, all right, these are earthquakes that are recorded well above those other earthquakes that are being talked about in this particular paper, right? There are other significant earthquakes, especially this one at 7500 BC, that are recorded as seismites. But where are those seismites? Well, hint, hint, they're way below 20 feet. Okay, all right. They're a lot below 20 feet. They're more like at the 40 and 50 foot stage. Right? But if you go down another 20 or 30 feet below the first 20 feet here, well, where are you going to get that? Where's that history come from? How do you fit that into the young Earth creationist timeline? They only have 250 years from the flood itself to this point where you have like recorded history of like from 4000 BC forward. And yet we have all these other recorded earthquakes and apparently records of previous settlements at this particular site in Jericho. This is also true for other locations, but again, I'm not going to cover those other locations, but the story is kind of the same. You have earthquake destructions that are much older than the Sodom and Gomorrah destruction. So that's a big issue, and it's a big challenge to young Earth creationists. All right, so Jericho's right here, and then the sediment core for which these earthquakes that are seen, and the earthquake is recorded at 7,500 years ago, or 7,500 BC, which remember is 9,500 BC, and 8,000 years ago, right? Those two particular seismites are very evident in the sediment column. And where's that sediment column come from? It's right here. This little white square right there is a site of paleo earthquake studies. There's actually multiple sites, but this main primary one is a sediment drill core right through the bottom of the Dead Sea Basin. And so that is recording those earthquakes that destroyed Jericho. But these are destructions that occurred well before 1400 BC. So you have Sodom and Gomorrah destruction, which presumably also would have destroyed other cities in the area as well. Even though Sodom and Gomorrah was the main focus of attention at that point in that story. But Jericho very well could have been, whatever settlement was there was destroyed by that earthquake as well. But then there's many other earthquakes recorded in that archaeological site. And because they correlate, I know I'm being repetitive here, but since they correlate with sediment profiles in which you can count up, remember there's little couplets or layers of almost like annual rings, and you can kind of count down those layers, and they correlate with the ages that are predicted from the archaeological sites. So all we're doing here is we're just sort of adding on another piece of data that we hadn't talked about, comparing into previous episodes, which we presented evidence for how we count up dates and if you were skeptical of some of those methods, here's another form of dating. I haven't got to how these were dated, all right, the archaeological sites. But here's another form of dating which is different, which is still yielding dates which are similar, if not the same, as those predicted from the sediment profiles, which is a different method of dating. When you correlate multiple methods and they all point to the same answer, it increases your confidence that you've got your chronology, you've got your timeline correct. I should have had this particular slide up here. When you look at this and you see the number of, like this is many, many, many meters. Now right here, we're 6 meters up to 15 meters up. So that's 9 meters, like 27 feet. That's 27 feet of rubble, right? That's piled up at this particular location. All right. So when you consider that this when you consider all those layers, this archaeological evidence from Jericho really challenges any notion that this city's history could somehow just be compressed into a few hundred years. Each one of these cities had to be rebuilt over some period of time. Okay, so I understand. If you're coming from a young Earth perspective and you're watching this particular series, the dates that I've been talking about probably are making you squirm, right? The dates for these ancient settlements might seem impossibly old. In fact, you believe they must be too old. After all, they extend well beyond that 4,500 year timeline that you're constricted to. So it's natural to be skeptical when confronted with information that challenges our existing beliefs. But I just would invite you to consider the evidence with an open mind. Remember, Christians, we believe that God is the author of both Scripture and of nature. And I think that if we're interpreting either one correctly, there really shouldn't be a conflict between the two. So let's just stick with me. Let's take a little closer look at how scientists determine in these ancient dates. How reliable are these dates? The dates I've shared aren't just sort of arbitrary numbers that scientists have sort of done a little bit of a, gut guess on, right? Yeah, this feels like this is about, or this is some kind of, no, they haven't picked these numbers out of thin air. I've become convinced they're the result of very careful, methodical research using multiple lines of evidence, often performed by fellow Christians. And you might be surprised how robust and consistent this evidence really is. So here are just a few methods that are used at various archaeological locations. Sometimes multiple methods are used. It depends on kind of what's present and available. There's radiocarbon dating, of course. Now that gets the bulk of all the discussion. Most people want to talk about radiocarbon dating. It's only good up to 50,000 years, but you have to have organic material, right? This is what you're gonna date: wood, seeds, charcoal. You're not dating rocks, all right, with radiocarbon dating. So that's one method, right? And you can get an approximation to some fairly good specificity within the last 10,000 years, especially. Then you've got your potassium argon dating, and that's going to be more of rocks and minerals. Typically, that's millions of years. We're not really dealing with potassium argon dating very much with anything that's very recent. It's not going to give you the kind of precision you need for something like archaeological dating. Now, there's a specialist form of dating called uranium thorium dating, and that's something you like from cave deposits, like lake deposits. We use that to determine past climate records sometimes. There's dendrochronology. Dendrochronology is tree ring dating and looking at the thicknesses of the annual growth rings. And then you can take trees that grew for 150 or 200 years. There's actually some fairly old trees in the mountains surrounding this area because of the slow growing conditions that are found in the Levant region. And you can take a series of rings, like say for over 200 years, and you can take another tree that lived, started growing 100 years into the life of the tree, next to it or near it, and then it grew for 200 years. And so for 100 years, it overlapped its life, right? And their lifespans overlap. And during that 100 years, there's going to be a characteristic pattern depending on the environment over that 100 years. It could be 10 years of famine and 10 years of plenty in the area, and that's probably going to result in thin annual rings and thick annual rings. And so by lining those up, eventually you can get sort of a dendrochronology of hundreds and thousands years even. And so what are people building, in their settlements? They're using mostly rocks, right? But they're also using timbers, right? Especially for roofs. And so you can take those timbers, ancient timbers that are preserved for us, and you can cut them into thin sections, and you can look at the rings, right? And you can figure out what that ring pattern matches to if you've created a dendrochronology for the region. By looking at many, many different trees that have overlapping segments. And eventually you can say like, oh, well, when I look at this particular timber, it has this characteristic pattern of tree rings. And so by matching those tree rings, you get an idea of like, hey, those timbers were used at this particular location, in at least within a few years, probably after that tree was felled. And then another one I particularly find quite interesting. It's not the most precise method, but it certainly will get you in the range of like, this is 5,000 years versus 5,500 years, all right, or 6,000 years, is optically simulated luminescence, or OSL. And this is something you can use to date pottery. you can date sediments, archaeological layers. Essentially what happens there, you're measuring the last exposure that particular material had to the sunlight. Just to give you just a really rough outline of this form of dating, when you have an object that is in the sun, it doesn't accumulate date. The radiation from the sun is breaking things down. And then after it gets covered, so if a piece of pottery gets covered, the sediment gets covered by new sediment layers, and then it's no longer exposed to the sun, then you're going to end up building up certain molecules, right, that aren't being broken down by the sunlight hitting them anymore. And the amount of that material that's built up, right, represents the amount of time that it hasn't been exposed to the sun. So it's a really fascinating form of dating, which is quite common in archaeological sites. The point is there's sort of multiple different methods in order for us to determine the age of different parts of an archaeological site. Because you might have the original ground and you're trying to figure out, like, when was that ground last exposed to the sun? Or you might have rocks, right? You might have stones as part of a building, and like, when did they get covered? That might be OSL. You might have timbers that are there, wood that gets buried, and like, well, when was that wood there? When was it last alive? All right, you figure that with dendrochronology. You got radiocarbon dating. You can do that on the trees as well to confirm your dendrochronology results. So you're using one form of data to try to get multiple different pieces of data that all hopefully point to the same date. So these are just some of the methods that have led us to understand the age of these archaeological sites and how long people have lived at each of these sites. But I think there's two other, like, more challenging forms of dating methods, which I want to spend a slightly more time describing. And one is travertine deposits. And as I called it in my blog, nature's slow motion builders. Travertine deposits are a type of limestone. You might be able to see it behind my text here is some limestone from basically hot springs that forms through the precipitation of calcium carbonate from mineral-rich waters. And typically these are in areas of hot springs, caves, waterfalls, some waterfalls. There's the Havasu waterfalls in Grand Canyon is really famous for its travertine deposits. They're often found at archaeological sites too in the Jordan Valley because, why? Because these sites are established around natural springs with high calcium carbonate levels, right? It's a pretty inhospitable place, mostly in the Dead Sea Valley, right? It's well below sea level. It's very dry. There's hardly any rain. And yet there are oases there and there's lush vegetation in some areas. Why? Because there is groundwater, all right? There is water that has fallen, in Palestine, and that water then has seeped through into caves, and then it's come down underneath the rocks, but eventually those rock layers are exposed down farther in the valley, and natural springs are there. So you have waterfalls and springs, but it's moved through material that's picked up a lot of calcium carbonate. And so when it's expressed at the surface, then that water begins to precipitate calcium carbonate and forms these layers, travertine deposits on whatever they touch, right? That could be on top of wood, could be on top of rock, on top of plants. It's going to start coating everything. So these calcium carbonate layers are little time-lapse cameras. Like, the longer that this buildup occurs, all right, the thicker the layer, the more time it must have taken, the more time has elapsed, all right, since that particular rock or that particular sidewalk or that particular piece of wood had been exposed to this spring water. So these calcium carbonate deposits have been observed to form really slowly, right? Typically less than 1 millimeter per year. So now we go back to Jericho. And in Jericho, there are travertine deposits that are up to 1.5 meters thick, okay? They've been associated with the Neolithic structures, which should be the oldest samples, all right, the oldest sites in Jericho. Now, of course, what they did was they built ditches, all right, to transport water from these springs, right, for water supply for the city. So the oldest of those water channels, right, have more than some have more than a meter of growth of travertine deposits on them. All right. And more recent, uses of water channels, all right, have thinner layers. And some of those are associated with different settlements at different eras, at different times. So even if we give a really generous estimate of 1 millimeter per year, that 1.5 meters of growth, right, of travertine deposit on something that we can see that a human being must have made, all right? It's a structure that humans put into place in order to transport water. And now there's 1.5 meters of this material there. That's 1,500 years, right? So if you go back to deposit, you go back to things that are 8,000 years old, 10,000 years old, and then there's 1,500 years of travertine deposit on it, right? These things are no longer water ducts, right? And maybe they haven't been for 4 or 5 or 6,000 years. But still, to get to that point, you have like 1,500 years pass. And then you have a younger site, right, that's been dated by other archaeological methods, ones that I just mentioned, right, dendrochronology or carbon-14 dating or something like that. And you can see like, yeah, this site is, it's 1,000 years old. And you have much, you don't have nearly as much travertine deposit on those if they've been exposed to the water for that long period of time. All right, so travertine deposits themselves speak to a long process, all right, a lot of time passing. And since you have multiple layers in the Jericho tell, right, you have multiple different locations where they have processed water over long periods of time. You kind of add all those up. It's like, well, you have 1,500 years here, and over here you have like an 800-year period. And over there you got like 500 years worth of deposit there, right? The time starts adding up. And then you also have speleothems, which I called underground climate archives. They tell us a lot about the change in the climate in the area. So, for example, there are a bunch of caves in Israel, not far from the Jordan Valley, up on the sides of the Jordan Valley. Researchers have found speleothems that provide a continuous climate spanning some 185,000 years based on uranium, thorium dating and several other dating methods. So that, again, is way longer than the young Earth creationist timeline. They would have to suggest that those speleothems, all right, stalactites and stalagmites, are all formed within a really short period of time. Some of these caves are completely dry today and look like they've been dry for thousands of years. And some of them we have evidence they've been dry for thousands of years because we have human occupation evidence, in which case you have maybe people have written on a speleothem or manipulated something long ago. We can see that, no, they haven't grown since then. All right. So it represents a past climate at some point where the speleothem was being formed. So if you have a speleothem, which itself may look like it took thousands of years to form, all right, and is even dated because you can slice open a speleothem like a stalagmite and you can look at the rings that are in it. And you can take little segments from the rings, kind of like dating a sediment profile, and you can take that and do uranium, thorium dating on the different layers. What you find is the inner layers are the oldest, and then as you work out toward the outer layers of the stalagmite, they're younger. And the difference between the inner and the outer would give you an idea of like how old that particular stalagmite is or how long it took to form. So in this paper here and a variety of others, they've used speleothems to track climate change to align with known historical events. So let's, forgetting the 185,000 years of history in some caves. Let's just go to some caves that have like active formation of speleothems, right, over the last 10,000 years. And so there they can take a very close snapshot of what's happened over the last 8,000 years. And they can see that there's been times of severe drought. They can see times in which there's been more water in the area. And then you can correlate that with, you can go to the sediment profiles in the Dead Sea. You can see like, oh yeah, the lake was higher at some points and it was lower at some points. I've already shown you we've already gone over many of those different charts. So if the lake is going up and down and you have speleothems that are recording, of course, all this assumes that the dating is correct. But the very fact that the speleothems, when they're dated, tell the same story as varves or counting layers in the Dead Sea sediments also show the lake levels going up and down, and the two correlate with each other. That's pretty powerful evidence that those methods are providing accurate information to us about the chronology of these areas and about the climate of these particular regions. So as we draw together the threads of evidence of archaeology, geology, paleoclimatology, a compelling picture emerges of the Jordan Valley's deep history. This synthesis not only challenges young Earth creationist interpretations, but also invites us to, I think, marvel at the really intricate ways that God has shaped the world over vast periods of time. And what strikes me most about the evidence we've explored is the remarkable consistency across different fields of study, as I was just saying. In addition to the dating methods discussed above, archaeological findings, geological processes, climate records all point to a history of the Jordan Valley that extends way beyond 4,350 years, as proposed by the young Earth creationists. So, as a Christian, myself, who takes both faith and science seriously, I find this convergence of evidence deeply compelling. It suggests that we're uncovering really genuine truths about our world's history, truths that reflect the intricate process that God has used to shape creation. So what are some of the challenges that this timeline compression has for young Earth creationists? Well, attempting to compress the evidence we've seen into a young Earth timeline, creates some pretty, what I think are insurmountable challenges. So consider the following. And a lot of these we've explored previously, right? We've got the issue of cultural development, right? There's the progression of simple stone tools. I didn't really talk about this before, but there are other locations which have stone tools, which are dated to much older than 20,000 years ago, right? You don't really have the same types of stone tool implements in like Jericho and the building of these other settlements that are more like what we'll call modern settlements. So there's that whole other issue of like this history goes even deeper. I just all I needed to do was talk about Jericho in order to make the point that it really doesn't fit into a 4,500 year timeline. And so there is an apparent sort of cultural development that we see at different locations that are dated to different times that represent a progression, that represent a sort of progressive timeline. So then, of course, there's geological processes. We've got the formation of the Rift Valley itself, the deposition of 15,000 feet of sediment layers inside of it, including like 6,000 feet of salt. Then we've got Travertine deposits, speleothems. All of these are like, pretty late developing things in the bigger scheme of the origins of the Dead Sea Valley. And yet they themselves suggest thousands and thousands of years of accumulation. We have evidence of climate fluctuations, that the climate has changed quite radically in this particular region multiple different times. Right, so we have cave formations that show multiple cycles of warming periods and cooling periods over what look to be tens of thousands of years based on the dating methods. And these also align with astronomical variations, ice cores from Greenland, other sites in Africa, right? This is all beyond the scope of what we're talking about here, but I can tell you that there's lots of correlations of this evidence with other evidence from other sites. So let me kind of try to wrap this up for this particular episode, because it's like I said, there's so much that could be said. And I think the writing in the blog will give you more details and references. I just wanted to use the video to kind of, give the big broad brush view of things. But I'll just say, what's the importance of actually doing and trying to determine the actual historical understanding? Trying to get as close as we can to understanding what actually happened. What is the timeline? What's the history of this particular location? All right, because as a Christian, I do care about ancient timelines. And I think there's several reasons why. All right, it's all about integrity. I have to be ready to try to deal with the evidence that I see. I can't simply, put my head in the sand, close my eyes, and pretend it doesn't exist. And I think, and I hope that that's some kind of witness to the world, to some of you that might be watching this particular video, that often might see faith and science as being completely incompatible, or that people who just aren't willing to at least even entertain or understand what the evidence is. Secondly, right, I, for myself, think that by understanding history better, by appreciating the complexity of these mechanisms and trying to understand the timelines, we're understanding a long, intricate process that I think that God has used to shape the world. And I think that that deepens our appreciation for his creativity and patience, not just snapping the fingers and saying, here it is, and you can't even understand this world because it's all supernatural. If it's supernatural, there really isn't any way to investigate. There's no way to really understand the things that I have done. So I think it invites us to learn more. It says, like, it's okay to explore because you actually have the chance of learning something. You are capable of actually coming to truths, coming to understanding of the way things have been made. All right, and then this last one is, it's like a really important thing to me, and it's just trying to be humble in our interpretation, both our interpretation of Scripture and our interpretation of the evidence of general revelation of the world around us. And that I'm pretty strongly hold to this idea that the Earth is pretty old, and that's because I've spent 30 some years actually looking at the evidence and investigating young Earth creationist claims, and finding that they don't have much merit in my mind, and that they don't have much merit. But that's not from just my first, I looked at one piece of evidence and I threw it out. It's a long process of coming to a better, a deep understanding of the processes of this world. And it's also a process of trying to understand how we interpret Scripture and where the true conflicts are between Scripture and our observations of the world, and where things really aren't as in conflict as one might originally think, right? And that might come through a better understanding of Scripture, reassessing one's hermeneutic method of interpreting Scripture. And it also comes with humility in terms of like the fact that we can't perfectly understand everything as creatures, right? We're trying our best. Our logic is flawed at times. But one way to safeguard against using really bad, flawed logic and coming to erroneous conclusions is to continue to work on it, right? To continue to investigate, continue to be open to thinking through these things, being open to being challenged by data like from the Dead Sea, and asking oneself, does this really fit my preconceived notions coming into a series like this? I guess as a Christian, and you who are watching this who may be a Christian of variety of shapes and flavors, all right, you got to ask yourselves, how do we reconcile what I think is what I'm going to say is overwhelming evidence for an ancient Earth from this particular location with our understanding of Scripture? Is it possible that maybe our interpretation of Scripture needs to be reconsidered in the light of what we observe in God's creation? Right? As we ponder these geological time capsules, all these different pieces of evidence, I think we're left with a profound appreciation for the deep historical record in the rocks of the Jordan Valley. It's a history that stretches way beyond written records. Really, everything that's in the written records is just in the very thinnest section of the top layer of sediments in the Dead Sea Valley. Right? It's a history that goes well beyond the earliest human settlements. So that invites us to expand our understanding of time, certainly, and our place, within time. For those of you out there that hold the Bible paramount, this evidence challenges us to think deeply about how we interpret Scripture. Could it be that God's methods of creation are more intricate, maybe more time-consuming than you maybe originally thought? Maybe our understanding of biblical chronology might benefit from the insights provided by these, what we'll call silent witnesses in the stones of the Dead Sea Valley. I believe that accepting the scientific evidence for an old Earth doesn't diminish the power and the truth of Scripture. For me, instead, it enhances our appreciation of the depth and complexity of God's creative work. It invites us to read Genesis not just as a scientific textbook first, but as a profound theological statement about God's relationship with creation, humanity's place in creation. Now, I'm not denying there aren't difficult questions to be asked, all right? I'm not saying this is all easy. If you have been challenged by this, if you have struggled with interpreting Scripture and understanding the world around you at the same time. So we still have a couple more parts of this series, and we're going to be exploring some of those concepts and ideas a little bit further. So as we're wrestling with these questions, let's just remember our goal is the truth, right? Both scientific and spiritual. By engaging honestly with the evidence before us, I think we're honoring God, right? The God of truth. And we're deepening our appreciation. All right, by engaging honestly with the evidence before us, right? By truly trying to understand it and say, what is God trying to say here? I think we're honoring God, right? We're honoring the God of truth, and we're deepening our appreciation for the wonders of his creation. So we're going to step back just a little bit, and we're going to explore just a little bit more of the biggest challenge that I am presenting as part of this Dead Sea Chronicles series to young Earth creationists in particular, and that is the amount of sediment that's below the Dead Sea or fills the Dead Sea basin. And in particular, we want to know about the precipitated salt that is found, right? The 6,000 feet of salt. So we're going to delve into the Dead Sea salt deposits, and we're going to calculate how long would it take to produce those, right, from precipitation from seawater. And we're going to see how those put a lower limit on the age of the Earth, which is really going to stress out the young Earth timeline. So we've got that coming up. Thanks, everyone, for hanging out with me. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye. Thank you for watching this installment of the Dead Sea Chronology series. As we've explored today, the Dead Sea region provides fascinating insights into Earth's history and raises important questions about how we interpret both scientific evidence and scripture. If you'd like to dive deeper into this topic, I invite you to visit my blog, Naturalis Historia, at thenaturalhistorian.com, where you'll find detailed articles exploring each aspect we've covered today, including full references and additional resources. Here's the schedule for upcoming episodes in this series. Each new video builds on what we've learned today, helping us better understand how geology and questions of the Earth's and our origins intersect in this remarkable region. You can learn more about my work and background at joelduff.org. If you found this content helpful, please consider subscribing and sharing with others who might be interested in exploring these important questions about science and faith. Thank you again for watching. Blessings to you and all who are around you.